The key to sustainable leadership lies in the ability to thrive in uncertainty, ambiguity, and change. Grand Heron International brings you the Coaching Assistance Program, giving your employees on-demand coaching to manage through a challenging situation and arrive at a solution. Visit grandheroninternational.ca/podcast to learn more.
This podcast is part of the C-Suite Radio Network, turning the volume up on business.
Welcome to the Keep Leading Podcast, a podcast dedicated to promoting leadership development and sharing leadership insights. Here's your host, the Leadership Accelerator, Eddie Turner.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Keep Leading Podcast, the podcast dedicated to leadership development and insights. I'm your host, Eddie Turner, the Leadership Accelerator. I work with leaders to accelerate performance and drive impact. Today, we're going to talk about lifting others up as leaders. Now, when we talk about lifting others up, sometimes it may sound like a great idea, but we may not know exactly how to do that. My guest today has created a framework on how we can do that effectively as leaders. My guest today is an amazing gentleman who has appeared all over print media, social media, and regular traditional media. Most recently on Dr. Oz show with Barbara Corcoran. My guest today is Robert Glazer. Robert is a founder, author, speaker, and expert in elevating performance in both business and life. He is passionate about helping individuals and organizations build their capacity to outperform. He is the author of the inspirational newsletter, Friday Forward, author of the Wall Street Journal and USA Today bestseller, Elevate, and the international best-selling book, Performance Partnerships. He's a sought-after speaker by companies and organizations around the world, and he has a podcast of his own, the Elevate Podcast. And today we'll talk about his forthcoming book, Friday Forward. Robert, welcome to the Keep Leading Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Eddie. You reminded me I got to start giving people the short bio so they don't have to suffer through it.
Well, you were so impressive as I looked at it. Usually I cut things out, but I was like, I don't know what to cut here.
Thank you.
So you and I have met because of our affiliation with the amazing Marshall Goldsmith and being selected as one of his 100 coaches. And you're someone who I've just been waiting to talk to in more detail for a long time now. I'm very impressed with what you're doing. And I, along with 100,000 other people in 60 countries on 6 continents, receive your newsletter every Friday. It's called Friday Forward. So tell us, for those who are not on the list yet, and who should get on the list, by the way, what is Friday Forward?
Yeah, and thank you for reading that. It keeps the pressure on me to come up with something compelling to write each week. But Friday Forward was sort of an outpost for me of having gone through a pretty intensive leadership program about 6 or 7 years ago, and really wanted to change my morning routine and a lot of advice around sort of taking some quiet time to think and to read and to write and to read things that were positive. And during this program, we were given some things to read. I would sort of put them in the rainbow and unicorny bucket, and it wasn't really my sort of motivation. And so I actually decided I'd combine the two things, and I started just writing this note to my team on Fridays. I think it was called Friday Inspiration at the time. Something about some quotes and some stories I had. It was about improvement. It was about getting better. It really wasn't tied to our business at all. And it started to make its way outside our organization, because I would hear back I didn't hear anything for a while. And then I hear back from people and they'd say, I really like this, or I went and I did this, or my husband shared this with his company. And so at some point I decided to try to open it up and throw some other people on it. And couple of people wrote articles, and I just opened it up and it started to grow. And yeah, it's crazy. Every time I send that on a Friday now, and I watch the little pins on all the countries that have been opening it, it's still a little foreign to me.
So for something that started off intended for a small audience, I mean, it just took off. What was the secret?
I think the secret, and I've told this to a lot of people, is just not having an agenda and creating value. I think a lot of people start something with a goal in mind. I really didn't have a goal. And so many times that I thought about stopping it. Why am I doing this? But it was really about how could I provide value first to my team and then to other people, and just some compelling thought and conversation. And I get a lot of emails from people saying, I delete every newsletter I read. I don't, but I read yours. And, I've had a ton of people want to sponsor or make it about something. And I've kept it pure to the topic. And I think that's what's kept the organic reach out there. There are a lot of leaders on the list, and they share it in their organizations. And then sometimes it makes its way then to an employee and then back out to a family. So it goes through a bunch of different pathways.
So in other words, you're telling me that there was no secret. It was you making compelling content and it organically catching fire.
Yeah, I think, the key sometimes to a successful blog and maybe a podcast is just duration and going at it with quality and past the point when most people quit. And I think that hockey stick, or that compounding effect, usually comes in over time. When you've put maybe it's just karma. When you put enough quality out there, eventually you start to get that back. But there were a couple sort of candle lighting moments. Someone wrote an Inc. article, "This is the only newsletter I ever read," early on, who had seen me speak at a conference and had gotten on the list. And yeah, a couple thousand people signed up that week. But no, it wasn't. Otherwise, it's kind of just been a slow and steady increase.
That is so impressive. And I love what you said there about duration and quality. So it's not just you're putting out quality content, but you're in it for the long haul. You've been doing it long enough. And so you've created a voice and you have a tremendous following. And I also like something else you said. You said you started with no goal in mind. Now, the trainer in me who teaches instructional design to individuals in the learning and talent development space always quotes Stephen Covey, I believe, who says, start with the end in mind. And you said, hey, I didn't have the end in mind. I just started off doing what I needed to do. I did it right. And here we are.
Yeah, I would normally give other people or myself that advice, but I think there's an exception to that. And I'm a big believer, and this comes from spiritual capacity and being able to know and articulate your core values. And the Friday Forward pretty much goes across all of my personal core values. And so when I was thinking about, or my marketing team was like, why are you spending time on this? And can you put our company name on it? And I just was like, this just feels easy and like something I should do. So I don't think you ever make a bad decision when you do something that's really aligned with your values.
Now, it's interesting you say that, and you jump right into the spiritual realm when you said that.
Yeah.
And in some corners, when you say that, people cringe.
I know. I cringe. I couldn't come up with a better name. It's not religious.
Well, that's why I asked that, because in your book, that's one of the first things that you talk about. And when you talk about having spiritual capacity, is you say, hey, wait a minute, folks. When you hear that, you may think religion, so fill in the but that you gave us in the book.
Yeah. So spiritual capacity is just what you want most. And I think for a lot of people, I would define it as their core value and or their core purpose. I think figuring out your core values first is often a precursor to your core purpose. Some of us are very clear on our purpose, and often that comes from some clear traumatic experience. But I just, to me, that's the compass for everything else and the North Star that comes after. I'm a big believer in alignment and alignment systems, and capacity building is kind of one of that. I think you got to know who you are and what you want to then work downward from there.
Yes. And so thank you for explaining that. And I remembered that when you said that, it triggered that because when I was reading it, that's what I saw.
Yeah.
And you have other capacity. Capacity building is a very specific thing that we talk about doing. Can you talk about what you mean when you say capacity building and then share with us the four areas
Sure.
or the framework that you give us in the book?
Yeah, so capacity building is really fundamentally the process by which we get better in its simplest form, and in pursuit of our own innate potential. And then, so that's our metric and our capacity. And we understand capacity in the realm of like physical capacity, which I'll get into. But if I lift this weight every day, 12 times a day, then after 30 days, I can lift more of the weight easier. And I think that applies to all of these realms. I think we tend to sometimes think these other things we have them, we don't have them. So spiritual capacity is knowing who you are and what you want. Intellectual capacity is a little bit of your operating system. This is how do I learn, plan, execute with discipline and have accountability, going after the things that are important to me, as per my values. Physical capacity is your physical wellness, how you manage stress, and just sort of the whole condition of yourself to take you on this journey. And then emotional capacity is really the first three are within you. Emotional capacity is a little different. It's how do you respond to the things that you don't control outside of you? So that's really a little bit. Resilience is a little split. Your sort of mental resilience comes into emotional capacity, and your physical resilience comes a little bit in physical capacity, and they play off each other. But if you think of them as like four quadrants of a ball, every high achiever I've ever seen is locked in on all of these. They're kind of growing in tandem. The ball's growing, it's getting mass. Then if you can imagine, momentum, one of those is really out of whack. I think you get a wobbly ball. And for a lot of people, it could be physical, or there are a lot of people who actually, I think, are really good at intellectual, physical, and emotional capacity. They've never actually taken the time to sort of figure out their values or what they really want. So they're living this achievement playbook that is other people's definition of success, and it's not fundamentally making them happy. I think that's where you see a lot of midlife crises occur.
Interesting. And so those four are the framework that you give for building this capacity so that we can lift others up as a leader.
Yeah, and really it was a playbook for ourselves. So what happened was when we were talking about this, I went to write the book Friday Forward, and a couple agents said, "Well, what's the story here?" They didn't like compilations because I had all these stories. And I actually went back for a while, and I said, okay, I started doing this Friday Forward thing. All these people around the world I don't know are writing me notes and telling me they're making changes to their life because of this. I've made a ton of changes in my life. We've grown our business, 10x, and we've done that by focusing on training people holistically. And I actually realized that it was all the same system. So that's one of the things we always had this thing where we worked on growing our team holistically. I never had the capacity of building vernacular to say, oh, what we're doing right now is training people on spiritual capacity or physical capacity or intellectual capacity. But that's what we were doing. Now we actually use those labels. So I take a group of 20 leaders offsite for advanced leadership training twice a year, and when there's not a global pandemic. And, I help them. Actually, one of the things we spend almost a day on is discovering their personal core values, because they are evolving as leaders in the organization. I don't think you can be an authentic leader if you actually don't know what your values are. And I think some are confused. They're like, well, what does this have to do? This isn't about business. This isn't about just me. And like, look, we'll get the business benefit of this if you figure this out, but you will get such a bigger benefit holistically in your life out of this once you figure this out, because it drives everything that you do.
Yeah. And you used the illustration about a ball moments ago, because I was going to ask you, is one of these more important than the other? But when you said that, it made me realize that it sounds like they need to be in concert. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I could give you an example in each one, right? So I gave you the example of spiritual capacity. If that's off, you're kind of running, your ball's rolling really fast, probably down the wrong hill. If your intellectual capacity is not growing, it's really hard to grow anything. I don't think your ball will get a lot of bigger, because if you're just not learning and you don't have any discipline or execution, you're not going to get very far. Physical, we all know what that looks like, right? I'm tired, I'm cranky, I lose the big picture, I don't handle my relationships well, I lose my discipline. I think physical, we see how that is often really an accelerant or a drag. And then emotional, right? There's people who just, the sort of brilliant person who's, on an island because they can't relate to others, they can't deal with the outside world. It takes being connected to others to sort of accomplish great things. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. So those are just examples, the extremes, but if you're struggling in one or more area, how it can kind of weigh down your overall performance.
That makes a lot of sense, Robert. I'm talking to Robert Glazer. He is a founder, author, speaker, and an expert in elevating performance in both business and life. We'll have more with Robert right after this.
Support for this podcast comes from Goldman Sachs. Through Launch with GS, a $500 million investment strategy grounded in the belief that teams with diverse leadership drive stronger returns, Goldman Sachs remains committed to facilitating connections and increasing access to capital for women, Black, Latinx, and other diverse entrepreneurs. Learn more at gs.com/launchwithgs.
Support for this podcast comes from Qualcomm Incorporated. As the world's leading wireless technology innovator, Qualcomm brought you 3G, 4G, and 5G, inventing many technologies inside the mobile devices you love. Get an inside look at 5G, a technology that can allow nearly everything and everyone to communicate and interact seamlessly on the Qualcomm Podcast. Dig into the inventions and opportunity of 5G and get a behind-the-scenes look at the future of wireless.
I think it's a privilege, a company like Qualcomm, that we work in telecom, we work in communications, and not only through this pandemic, which is a very difficult situation, but through our history, we have seen how much the technology we work on can actually change society and help.
If you love technology, you'll love the Qualcomm Podcast. Listen to the Qualcomm Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or SoundCloud.
This podcast is sponsored by Eddie Turner, LLC. Organizations who need to accelerate the development of their leaders call Eddie Turner the Leadership Accelerator. Eddie works with leaders to accelerate performance and drive impact. Call Eddie Turner to help your leaders one-on-one as their coach, or to inspire them as a group through the power of facilitation or a keynote address. Visit eddieturnerllc.com to learn more.
This is Karen Jacobson, the GPS girl, and you have reached your destination because you're listening to the Keep Leading podcast with Eddie Turner.
All right, everyone, I am back. I'm talking to Robert Glazer. He is a Wall Street Journal and USA Today best-selling author of the book Elevate. Today, we're talking about lifting others up as leaders and about Robert's forthcoming book, Friday Forward. Robert, before we took a break, you were telling us about the framework that leaders can use to build capacity. You gave us those 4 elements, but now you said it was originally written to lead themselves as leaders. Can you talk about examples of how they can use these 4 elements to lead others?
Yeah, so it was really a framework for herself, but in terms of thinking about leadership development, and this is how we break it down. As I mentioned before, we help people figure out their values as they're developing a leader. I don't think if you're clear on your values, we have some empirical data on this. We took assessments of some of our kind of up and coming leaders. We then did this offsite and this curriculum, and then they went back to their teams and said, here's what I figured out about myself. Here's what's important to me. Here's how I'm going to show up for you. Here's what you can expect about me and otherwise. And almost universally, their scores went up over the next couple of months because they understood things about themselves. And I think it's very hard. This is helping people increase their self-awareness, which is a critical component of leadership. And then, intellectual, anything we're doing to help people learn how to do something better, whether it's learning how to handle difficult conversations, learning how to prioritize, learning how to time management, energy management, all of these things that allow them to do more with less. And we also encourage the physical side. So we've helped people, we encourage them to take time off, take rest. We've hired coaches to help people who want to try to run a marathon or a half Ironman or something like that for the first time. And then on emotional capacity, we have an event every year called AP Summit. We always do something that really dives into vulnerability and team building and getting people to lean into relationships, have open conversations, have psychological safety. Last year, we did an event with someone named Philip McKernan. You might know he runs an initiative called One Last Talk, and 4 employees volunteered to give sort of the last talk that they would want to give if this was their last day on Earth to the entire company. And these were very personal speeches, and they just opened up the door to so much sharing and vulnerability and people realizing they had all kinds of things in common that they didn't before. So we do try to follow that playbook across all of our development, because I think it is the key building blocks to someone basically, instead of trying to make them better at their job, increasing their capacity so that they're ready to serve your organization at higher levels.
Wonderful. And I can't help but think about how important that is, especially now during a time of the global pandemic that we're facing. Can you talk about how you've been able to use this to help people during this time?
Yeah, it's funny. We've used almost all of it. So in terms of spiritual capacity, we actually came up with a rubric, our sort of zoomed in value set over the next 5 months, knowing that we have to make a lot of tough decisions, but these were sort of our rules of engagement from first to last, starting with supporting our core values. So we were able to kind of lock in with everyone and say, this is what's most important, and these are the rules that we're going to kind of stick to, and you can hold us to that. On intellectual, we've been focused on, we spun up, new committees, new calls, pivoting where we could, trying to just, drive as much innovation as we could. Physical, really encouraging people to take time off, trying to figure out how people could cover for each other. And in the emotional realm, it's been the last couple of months between the pandemic and then the ensuing whole racial events in the United States after that, it's been an emotionally draining time for people. And so we've really tried to work on having those discussions, just having really productive discussions, vulnerable discussions around all of these topics, understanding where people are, how we can help them, and people understanding that they have each other's backs, and trying to get through what are a lot of different challenges right now. So yeah, I think we've really kind of leaned in all those quadrants.
Wonderful. And when you look at being able to get people there, lift people up, you're ultimately trying to help people be successful. But you talk about in your work that there's something different about success and achievement.
Yeah, and that goes a little bit to the comment earlier around spiritual capacity and not having that sorted out. I think a lot of people see success as what someone else had envisioned for them, whether that was their parents or their social environment or their culture or their teachers. And I think it's, maybe that parent envisioned success as being a lawyer at a highfalutin, New York law firm at which they're totally miserable, when really deep down in their soul, they want to be in a cabin in Idaho writing books. and that's what would make them happy. And that would be their biggest contribution to the world. And so to me, achievement is the attainment of what it is that you want most. I think, that could also be success, but I hear success a lot where someone says like, oh, Eddie is just so successful. Like, you could be absolutely miserable. I don't know that, right? I could be trying to emulate you and you could be miserable. And so I hear success used a lot when people are like, oh yeah, Eddie or Shirley is successful, or really. And I just always find that interesting, because I think it's some external definition of success.
That's so true. And I see that, obviously, I'm sure you do in your work as a coach, where part of what we're trying to help people to achieve or to stop trying to achieve is other people's expectations. And so I love your explanation on that and what you've been helping people to understand.
Yeah, those are weighty. Other
Oh
people's
my.
expectations. Yeah.
And when they can just get that off their shoulders and do what they want to do,
Yeah.
they
And look,
become a completely
these are
different
great,
person.
not to say that pandemics are great times for this, but I mean, how many people have you and I met who are, in that sort of midlife crisis area, but they're really well paid and it's really comfortable. And then just say, well, I'll just wait another year. And but they don't like what they're doing. I think these times actually can help a lot of people by just closing a door that you're unwilling to close and forcing you to go in another direction.
Yeah, that is so important. It's so true. Earlier, you told us about the 4 areas about capacity building. Let's get some examples so that we'll crystallize it a little bit more for our listeners. So you talked a lot about intellectual capacity. So why don't we start there? If someone picks up the book and they jump right into intellectual capacity, what would they get?
Yeah. So one of the things I think they'll read more about and learn about is sort of goal setting and how goal setting works. What should long-term goals look like? What should short-term goals look like? And how do short-term goals build into long-term goals? And then make sure that those are the things that they actually want. And then also, we know that accountability is really important with and routine are really important with goals. So then how do you set up the routine and the right accountability to make sure that you move towards those goals?
Excellent. As coaches, we always like that. So that'll be the first section that I'm recommending to folks. You started us off with spiritual. What will they get there? Any examples?
Yeah, there's some resources there and some questions that they'll get to if you haven't figured out your core values, some specific questions you can start to think about that will lead you down that path towards being able to better understand and articulate your core values.
Yes, and that is so important. And physical capacity. You talked about what happens where, especially during COVID, we've been eating bad perhaps and doing some other activities or less activities because we've been shut in. So physical capacity.
Yeah, my ice cream consumption is way up the last couple of months for
Yes.
sure. Yeah, I mean, beyond the obvious stuff, I think one of the things talking about is how to embrace competition and to use that to raise your physical performance and also to build resilience at the same time.
Yeah, and I as I look at your book here, this whole section on Peloton principle, and well, I can't wait to dig into that a little bit more. And finally, emotional capacity.
Yeah. So one of the things in emotional capacity that I actually recommend for a lot of people is to sort of make a list and put some relationships on there about who are the relationships that need frankly you to walk away from in a little less time because they've run their course or they're kind of dragging you down, or who are the people that you want to really double down on and spend more time with so that you start making your network kind of reflect your ambitions and your values.
Yes, so important. And something else that you've got in that section that I think is really, really important is the importance of random acts of kindness. What an excellent way of lifting others up as leaders.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard. I think I said in there, it's hard to be thinking about others and then overly focused at yourself at the same time. I think a lot of suffering is a focus on ourselves. So even if you think about where we are now, right, in the middle of a pandemic, I think there are people that are looking uphill at the stuff, for a better word, that's rolling down onto them and being like, woe is me, or they're looking downhill at people that are in a worse situation than them and thinking, wow, I'm lucky, and how can I help those people?
Indeed. Indeed. So what would you say is the overarching theme that you want people to leave this conversation knowing?
I think in the realm of capacity building, what's really neat and what I've seen is that when you commit to this level of improvement for yourself, you will bring other people on the same journey as you. They will see that, they will act on it, and we have this society today where we just seem to spend a lot of time knocking each other down and telling people why they're wrong and what they can't do. And I think we just have a real opportunity to work on lifting each other up and helping them do better and do more and have a vicarious circle, not a vicious circle.
I like that. A vicarious circle, not a vicious circle. That's awesome. Now, this is the Keep Leading podcast. And on the Keep Leading podcast, we always like to give leaders a quote or the best piece of leadership advice you've ever received to help leaders keep leading.
Yeah, so one of my favorite quotes I'll go with, and quotes are so misattributed, so I don't even know who originally said it. But how we do anything is how we do everything.
Ooh, I love that one. I use that all the time. And I attribute it to the person who I heard say it, but you're right. I don't know where she got it from, but I always give her.
I learned that when I went to write my book and I had all these quotes that I pulled from these quote sites, and then they have a quote researcher, and it all came back that they were like all wrong. So I now don't believe, I now don't trust the attribution of any quote.
Oh, that's awesome. Yes, I agree with you on that. Yeah. So how can my listeners learn more about you, to follow you, read your books? Tell us something more.
Sure. Best place to go is Robert Glazer, Glazer.com. That's got links to the podcast, to my books, to Friday Forward. And there's a page where I put a bunch of condensed stuff for people who are listening and some resources we might have talked about today, which is robertglazer.com/connect.
Outstanding. So what we're going to do is put all of this into the show notes to make it easy for people just to click on it so that they can find you, connect with you, and get on that newsletter list, start to listen to your Elevate podcast so that they can elevate and continue to lift others and themselves up as leaders. Robert, thank you so much for being a guest today on the Keep Leading podcast.
Thanks, Eddie.
And thank you for listening. That concludes this episode, everyone. I'm Eddie Turner, the Leadership Accelerator, reminding you that leadership is not about our title or our position. Leadership is an activity. Leadership is action. It's not the case of once a leader, always a leader. It's not a garment we put on and take off. We must be a leader at our core and allow it to emanate in all we do. So whatever you're doing, always keep leading.
Thank you for listening to your host, Eddie Turner, on the Keep Leading podcast. Please remember to subscribe to the Keep Leading podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen. For more information about Eddie Turner's work, please visit eddieturnerllc.com.
Thank you for listening to C-Suite Radio, turning the volume up on business.